Over the past few weeks, I've been playing around with watercolors and gouache, and more specifically, combining the two and adding white gouache to watercolors to turn them into a sort of gouache. I used this method kind of the first time in this painting here, which I have a video for on my channel, but the topic of this video was completely different from this, so I didn't get to talk about this. And I didn't just add white gouache to this, I really just used both my watercolors and my gouache paints, and I just painted with them together. I made a separate video, which is the one that you're about to watch, for this painting right here, and this one was done entirely with watercolor and only white gouache paint. So I'm going to show you the process for this, and I want to talk a little bit about the reasons why I think this is such a good and fun method to use. I won't talk too much about the actual process because there's not much to it. It's really very similar to just painting with watercolors or gouache. I think the trickiest part, which isn't really that tricky at all as it's more of just a personal preference, is deciding how much opacity to add to your watercolors and where to use an opaque mixture versus a transparent mixture. For me personally, I have found that most of the paintings that I've made this way have started with a layer of just watercolors, and then I will add gouache as I need to throughout the process. Because I have the ability to work with either transparent mixes or opaque mixes, it's really just depending on the situation. Sometimes I will paint a majority of the painting with watercolors and then add a few accents with gouache when I need to towards the end. And sometimes it's kind of a back and forth between watercolors and a more opaque gouache mixture. Again, it's really just personal preference. It's up to you. It's about your taste and what kind of results you're looking to get. So watercolors and gouache are two very similar mediums, but there are some pretty important differences between the two. Obviously, the main one being that watercolors are transparent, whereas gouache is opaque. If you add a ton of water to your gouache paints, you can get similar results to what you usually get with watercolors. But if you've ever tried doing that, you'll know that it's very much not the same. It's not really close to being the same. Way that the colors interact with one another when you wet them a lot, it doesn't happen the same way as it does with watercolors. And the reason for that is dispersant agents. A dispersant is something that's added to paint that makes it so it has an easier time mixing with water. So this is added to watercolor paint to make it so that the pigment spreads into water a lot more easily. If you've ever tried dipping your brush into some paint and then touching an area of your page that was already wet, you'll know that when you do that with watercolors, the paint will immediately shoot away from your brush and just start filling the page with these beautiful blooming effects. That's because of the dispersants that are present in watercolor paint. Gouache, on the other hand, doesn't have as much of that dispersant usually. So that's why when you do the same thing with gouache, the paint just kind of sits there. It doesn't really bloom that much. It will if you add a ton of water and if you really force it, but it's not going to be as organic, as natural, and as seamless as with watercolors. And that's one thing that I personally love about watercolors. It's the fact that they do that. And I know it's one thing that many people find frustrating about watercolors is the fact that they are so difficult to control because they will just do whatever they want. They will follow the water, they will just move around in unpredictable ways. And to me, that's one of the most beautiful things about them. A quick side note, because I have praised these sketchbooks in so many of my videos, I don't know what those lines are. I noticed them in this page for the first time ever, and I have 4 of these sketchbooks. I have painted in each and every one of them with different mediums. I have never seen this happen, so I think it's just a manufacturing defect of some kind. It looks like the paper was scored lightly and it's just catching more of the paint. I just wanted to point it out. I enjoy painting in a looser style, so it works for me. I love just adding colors within colors and just letting them do their thing and seeing what happens, which is something that I could never do with gouache because gouache just doesn't work that way. By painting this way, I have the ability to do that when I want to, but I can also reel that in and make my paint more opaque and reduce the amount of blooming that I get and have more control over where the paint goes and what it looks like. Reason number two why I've been loving this is just the fact that I have access to all the colors that I have on my watercolor palette. I think that watercolor colors are so much better than the colors you find in any other medium, whether it's gouache, oils, or acrylics. I don't know how to explain it, but they just look better. They look more real. There's more to them. And there's a much bigger variety of them. Thing with watercolors being transparent is that you have access to this whole other dimension of color, which is the interplay it has with light. When you paint opaquely, you don't really get that. The color that comes out of the tube is the color that goes on the page. Yes, it's going to be darker, lighter when it dries, etc., and you can tweak it by adding different colors, but light doesn't really add much to it. In order to make that happen, you have to use mediums. For example, if you paint with acrylics, you can use some mediums to make the colors more transparent. You can layer them, you can glaze them, and get similar effects as you would with watercolors. But watercolors just do that out of the box. And so many of the colors you have access to for watercolors just look so much more interesting. They have these beautiful effects. I've talked about this a bit in the video I made about my watercolor kit, where I go over some of the colors that I have on my palette. And some of those colors are just so incredibly beautiful, like the moon glow that I have that has these iridescent color shifts within it. You can't really get that with opaque colors because, again, once you add opacity, you just lose out on the possibility for the color to do that. And of course, if you add gouache to those beautiful iridescent watercolors, they will just turn into one simple color because, again, that's what happens when you make them opaque. But the thing is that with this method, you get to choose when to add opacity. If I want to use moon glow and I want it to have those crazy effects that it usually has when it's transparent, I can use it as it is. If I want to make it a little bit more opaque because I need to paint opaquely with it, then I can do that too. Which brings me to my third point, which is you get the best of both worlds. You get the pros of both mediums with really none of the cons. If you only paint with watercolors, you don't get to paint opaquely if you need to. If you only paint with gouache, you get the opacity, but you miss out on all the beautiful layering effects and glazing effects you can get with watercolors. Now, of course, I totally understand that some people would never put gouache in their watercolors, and that's perfectly valid. I don't mind myself. I mean, I love both mediums, that's the thing, and I love things about both mediums, but I always miss some other things when I work with only one or only the other. So that's why I've been really enjoying working this way, is because I don't have to compromise. I really think this might become my go-to way of painting with gouache, just because of the flexibility that it provides. Now, I have made some paintings where I did actually use my full set of gouache colors alongside my watercolors and painted with them together instead of just using white gouache with my watercolors. And you can do that too. There's no reason why you shouldn't, but I found that there's really no need, because just using white gouache is usually enough to get me the colors that I need without having to go and reach for my gouache paints. Another thing I should mention, especially for those of you who aren't too familiar with gouache, it's that in a similar way to how you would paint fat over lean with oils, you should paint gouache over watercolors for the most part. The reason for that is that watercolors don't lift up nearly as much as gouache. If you put down a layer of gouache and then put a wet mix on top, that gouache is going to re-wet very quickly and it's going to spread all over the place and it's not going to be pretty. So avoid putting straight watercolor mixes on top of gouache unless that watercolor mix has very little water in it. By the way, this painting is available as a print on my website. If you're interested in grabbing yourself a copy of it, you can go to the link down in the description, where you'll also find links to all the supplies that I've used in this video, as always. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you liked watching the process and hearing me rambling about watercolors and gouache. If you did, leave a like, subscribe to see more, and I will see you next time.